and now I can do a rename refactor and give this a proper name. So now I have several different mappings. First, I have a mapping from my entity into my DTO object. Then I have a mapping from my create habit DTO into my entity, which also takes care of setting some initial fields. And we have our habit queries, which encapsulates our EF core projection. So let's move the habit queries into its own file. And for now, since it's only dealing with mappings, let's leave it inside of the DTOs folder. So let me close this down. Let's also close down the habit mappings class, and let's go back to our controller. So what we have here is a mapping from the habit entity into my DTO. We can significantly simplify this now with the new extension method that we have, and now I can say habit to DTO. This will give me back a habit DTO instance that I can return as the response of my create habit method. And now let's discuss what is the correct status code to return from this endpoint. The most appropriate status code is 201 created. And what you can do is use the created@action method, which allows you to specify an endpoint where the client can find the newly created resource. Let's create an object that's going to represent the route value for this endpoint, which only contains the identifier, and you can also return the complete DTO as the response of this endpoint. So let's go ahead and start the application, and I will place a breakpoint at the start of this endpoint. Inside of Postman, I already prepared a post request, which I can send to my controller, and it contains an example request body that I'm going to send to this endpoint. So let's say I want to create a daily coding habit. It's going to be a type 2, which is a measurable habit, and I want to perform this once per day. This is determined by the type, where 1 is a daily habit, and then the target value is, let's say, 30 minutes of coding per day. So let's send this request, and I will hit a breakpoint in my controller. If I take a look at the create habit DTO, you can see that the mappings are respected and all of the required properties are set. So now I can go into my extension method and map this into a new habit instance. This is going to set some other fields like the identifier, the habit status, when it was created, and I can return into my endpoint, add it to my database context, and after completing save changes async, this is persisted inside of my database. Now I'm going to map from the entity, which contains all of the information required to map into a representation, the habit DTO, and we're going to map this into a habit DTO instance. So I'm going to press continue here, and we get a response back in Postman. Now I first want you to observe the response headers, and notice that there is a location header here with a fully qualified URI pointing to the habits resource, and we also have a habit ID. This is the URI where I can find the newly created resource. So if I send a GET request to this endpoint, you will see that we are getting back our newly created habit. Now let me close this down. I don't want to save this. And if I take a look at the response body, we also have the newly created habit because we returned that as the response. The response status code is 201 created, which is the most correct status code when creating a new resource. Now I want to show you something else. Let's say I try to send another request, and for example, let's say I send null for the name of the habit. What's going to happen when I send this request? Let's click send, and you can see we get back a 400 bad request response saying that the name field is required. But where did I even specify any validations as to which properties are required or not? This is actually the API controller attribute that we added on the habits controller, performing some basic input validation for us. Validation is something I omitted on purpose as part of this lesson because I want to cover it in more depth in an upcoming lesson, but I did want to show you that by just creating our DTO, decorating some fields with required, and even using the correct data types, for example using a string versus a nullable string, makes a big difference, and the API controller attribute already considerably helps you when it comes to input validation. One last topic I want to discuss before wrapping up this lesson is mapping to and from DTOs and what options we have available. What I showed you here is using simple manual mapping. We created some simple extension methods in our code that allow us to map from a DTO into our entity and from our entity into a DTO. Having different internal and external contracts allows us to support encapsulation inside of our solution and hide any sensitive information that we don't want publicly available on our API, and it also allows us to evolve these two models independently. However, it does introduce the burden of mapping. Now, if you don't want to do this manually, there are many popular mapping libraries that you could consider, such as Automapper, Mapperly, Mapster, and many more that exist out there. But at the end of the day, none of these mapping libraries will come as close as a hard-coded manual mapping. So one more option that I think you should consider is using the AI coding tools that we have available at our disposal to simply define your mappings. For example, you can ask GitHub Copilot to create a mapping that you need to perform instead of you having to type it out manually. So that's just a little food for thought. I will not be using any mapping libraries inside of this course because I don't like using them. I prefer it when I write the mappings myself. And with this, we're going to wrap up the lesson about creating resources in our REST API. And now that we have some resources to work with, we can move on to our next lesson, which is updating resources using the put HTTP method.